There's been a lot of problems with over-tourism in Europe lately. Majorca gets too many drunken Brits and Germans and Scandinavians. Venice and Rome are always completely overcrowded. And locals in Barcelona have gone on huge protests, even spraying visiting tourists with water to get them to go away. I mean, that works on cats, but I'm not so sure that it works on tourists. But all of that happens in the Mediterranean. Spain, France and Italy, those are the most popular tourist destinations, so they're hit the hardest. But there's a bit of that in Sweden too, especially when it comes to Sweden's biggest island. Today I'm gonna talk about the over-tourism of Gotland. Gotland is a very popular destination, especially for vacationing people from Stockholm. But it also attracts visitors from all of Sweden and the rest of Europe. It's easy to see why. Gotland is full of history and has a milder climate than a lot of the rest of Sweden. The beach at Södersand in the northeast of Gotland looks just like a beach in the Mediterranean, for example. And there's plenty of other amazing sights on the island, from caves to quirky museums to all kinds of other attractions. Gotland is also famous for art and for its food and drink. And most of all, it's famous for the UNESCO World Heritage town of Visby, with its 3.4-kilometer long medieval wall. Visby is a favorite destination for most visitors to the island. Many who come to Gotland don't even see anything outside of the town. And that's also part of the problem. The whole island of Gotland has a population of 61,000 people, and 24,000 of them live in the town of Visby. Every year, around 1 million tourists visit Gotland. That's a pretty high number for such a small population. Especially since many tourists only stay in Visby. That puts an enormous pressure on the local infrastructure, and it also pushes people out from the city. 3 weeks per year are extra touristy. One is the Medieval Week, which takes place in August every year. The whole town becomes flooded with medieval reenactments and tourists. Another touristy week is the Stockholm Week in July, when rich brats from Stockholm invade Visby to show off their dad's money, for some reason. And finally, there's the Almedal Week, when politicians invade Gotland to have political debates and to eat and drink well on the taxpayers' expense. There are even more themed weeks than those three. There's the Gotland Art Week, for example, and the Ingmar Bergman Week. But those aren't as negatively viewed as the other tourist weeks. I'd say that it's mostly because they don't attract quite as many visitors. But why is it a problem that tourists visit Gotland? Isn't it a good thing that people bring tourist money here? Well, ask Barcelona about that. Why do you think that locals there have been protesting and actively try to force tourists away? Tourism is great, up to a certain point. It opens up new job opportunities and it brings new life to a place. Lots of new people and new ideas. And most of all, new money. But as the esteemed philosopher Notorious B.I.G. expressed it, more money, more problems. So what exactly are those problems? Well, let's look at Barcelona, for example. Barcelona didn't used to be an overcrowded mess of a city just a few decades ago. Before 1990, it was just a lovely Spanish city, like so many others. But then the Olympics happened in 1992, and then the cruise ships arrived. In 1990, Barcelona had 115,000 cruise ships arrive every year, but by 2017, that number was up to 2.7 million. And all of those cruise ship passengers got off the boat to look at the city, so the city got crowded, but they didn't really spend all that much. Sure, this tidal wave of cruise ship passengers spent some money at the tourist cafes and the tourist restaurants, but not so much in the rest of the city. And that meant that the cafe and restaurant owners got an incentive to focus even more on touristy cafes and restaurants. In other words, Barcelona got fewer and fewer places for regular people and more touristy crap. Everyone who visits Barcelona isn't a cruise ship passenger, though some also spend the night. And that's the second part of the problem. With so many visiting tourists who want to spend the night, people started investing in apartments that they could rent out to tourists. And that of course drove up apartment prices so that regular people couldn't afford to live in the city any longer. So the overtourism of Barcelona isn't just that there's a metric crap ton of tourists, because there are. It's also that they're making the place unlivable for regular people. Partly because of the apartment prices, and partly because everything that's offered is catering to tourists. Now let's compare that with the situation on Gotland. Gotland doesn't get many cruise ships like Barcelona does, so it doesn't have to deal with cruise ship passengers who only spend a day. Instead, they have to deal with visitors who arrive from Nynäshamn, south of Stockholm, and to a lesser degree Oskarshamn. And there are many people coming to this island. Gotland has traditionally been plagued by people from Stockholm. It's a bit of a meme really that Stockholm invades Gotland during certain times of the year. It hasn't always been a bad thing, and it isn't just a bad thing. Tourism brings in money and new people to the island. It's all a matter of scale. Gotland's infrastructure, especially in Visby, isn't designed to cope with all the visitors. Sometimes during summer, there's a water shortage, for example. Native Gotlanders are encouraged to bathe in the sea instead of using potable water, for example, while visiting tourists waste a lot of water just like they do on the mainland. And when visitors come to the island, they expect to find restaurants and cafes. That means that Visby in particular needs to have a lot of restaurants and storefronts and whatnot to accommodate all the visitors. What happens then is that the city center becomes filled with businesses that are only open during the summer months, just like in many other tourist destinations. And when the tourists leave, all they're left with is an empty backdrop of a city, devoid of life and devoid of people. Because it's not just a minor inconvenience during summer that the place is crowded, it also affects the city long term. Visby isn't just filled with restaurants and stores that are only open during summer, it's also filled with apartments that are rented out in summer. Because God forbid that a tourist has to travel or walk to get to the center of the action. And it's not just apartments and Airbnbs, there's also hotels taking up space in the city center. The city has become segregated. The inner parts of Visby belong to the tourists these days, while the native people live further out. Visby really is a dead backdrop of a town when it's out of season, which in itself can be pretty nice, but it's not beneficial for having a healthy city. So the tourists are pushing people out of the city center, just like in many other tourist destinations. But the problems don't stop there. What happens when people from Stockholm visit Gotland and really enjoy it here? And that goes for visitors from the rest of Sweden as well, and international visitors. But Stockholm has been the primary culprit. Well, they start thinking about buying an apartment in Visby or a cute house somewhere else on Gotland. And what happens then? The real estate prices go up. In 2022, Gotland had the lowest median income in all of Sweden. And Stockholm, that's where you find the highest incomes. So people from outside of Gotland who want to buy a property don't really have all that many problems in doing so. But the people on Gotland, they see prices soaring, not just when it comes to houses and apartments, also food and drink and everything else. It's pretty standard gentrification, like you see in so many other places in the world. The difference is that now we're not talking about the Mediterranean or big cities in big countries elsewhere. Now we're facing this problem in Sweden instead. And I guess that's not really something people expected. So what's gonna happen in the future? Just like in other parts of Europe, people on Gotland are getting fed up with the situation. Lately, there's been talk of restricting the number of visitors to the island or even imposing a tourist tax. The argument is that Gotland has a lot of historical artifacts to maintain, like the medieval walls surrounding Visby. And the summer tourism is putting a lot of wear and tear on it, as well as on the nature of Gotland. Tourism brings in money, but at this point it's not enough to cover the costs, so something will have to be done. People argue that if Rome and Barcelona can introduce tourist taxes, why can't Gotland? So maybe that's the way things will go, but it doesn't really solve all the problems, does it? Gentrification is still an issue, and Visby will still be an empty backdrop out of season. It's a pity for the people of Gotland that they have such a beautiful island full of history and amazing sights. So it's unfortunately inevitable that people will be drawn there. And that's about it. That was a quick look at the over-tourism of Gotland, Sweden's biggest island. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day.